Hello. How's everybody doing today? Hey, Ghosty. Kitty Star, Ben. Hey, Xion. How's everybody doing today? Feels so late at 8. Yeah, that rhymed. I'm glad you're doing well, Ben. Hey, Caffeine. I still love this music every single time. Vibrating with anticipation. Well, that's a phrase. I'm doing well, Kitty. Thanks for asking. I just finished up working for the day. I thought it would be fun to hang out and talk about therapy-related things, as you do. Hi, Michael. Bundling in blankets tonight. That sounds so good. I've realized with holidays coming up, at least where I am, there's a lot of this idea of like comfort food, and that always makes me think about like how we define comfort. Is comfort like bundling up in a blanket, or is comfort like certain foods? I always think of comfort as warm hot cocoa because of course my definition of comfort has to include sugar. That's just how that has to go. But comfort is such an interesting thing because it's so subjective. Like, is comfort a physical thing around us, or is it like a food thing that we ingest? It's always an interesting concept. I think of interesting, when I say an interesting concept, I think of things that are interesting are the things that can vary so much from person to person. Comfort's a state of being. Yeah, but again, like when I think of that, I think of it being like comfort can be like warmth. Comfort can be like physical fullness. There's so much to that still. And maybe these are just the things that I find interesting because I talk to people about like what does that mean? Whatever brings you to that state. Yeah, it is going to vary from person to person. I'm also really sorry, Ghosty, that you ate the last Kit Kat because maybe for you, comfort is Kit Kats. But we can't tell Kit Kat that, otherwise they'll put that in their marketing. We can't give them that much power. Hi, Basil. Ooh, comfort is having your needs met. I haven't thought of it that way before. That's an interesting way to think of it. So if comfort is having our needs met, does that mean that hot cocoa is meeting my needs? Hi, see the player you mean, and Mega Eevee. We were talking about comfort, or at least I was talking about comfort. Nothing, we were not talking about Kit Kats. Not being cold is comfort. Yeah, like cold outside and inside, because hot cocoa definitely warms me on the inside, and having a blanket on me warms me on the outside. So then does that mean that having hot cocoa plus a warm blanket is like the ultimate power combination of comfort because I'm warm both on the outside and the inside? Ooh, with cats. So would cats fulfill like an emotional comfort need? So then we would have a blanket for like the outside warmth that is like comfort, and then hot cocoa for the inside warmth, and then cats for like the emotional warmth. Power comfort. Cat videos to warm your heart. That reminds me of those old books. They probably still make them, where it's like chicken soup for the something soul. I don't know if they still make those books. That's what that makes me think of, though. It would be like chicken soup for the person who wants comfort soul. Oh, and cats purr, it's comforting. Makes me feel safe. Oh yeah, that's another idea about comfort. Like comfort may be getting our needs met, but also feeling safe. Hi, Rainy Channel. I am good. I've just finished up a work day, and I thought that I would chill out and talk about things, apparently comfort, and talk about more therapy things. Cats are the best. Comfort is the feeling of a warm hug. Oh, Starless Strawberry, happy early birthday. Yeah, I think there are so many things that are comfort because it's so subjective. It's like how, like, what our favorite candy is, right? Like there's going to be so many different answers because we're all individual people, and how we define comfort is so different. But comfort is also so important. I think of comfort as being something that goes with like rest and relaxation at a certain point, right? Comfort is gooey mac and cheese. Yes, I can definitely see that. When I think of that, I think it has to be like good mac and cheese. Certain types of mac and cheese just don't hit the spot for me the same as like other types of mac and cheese. Hey, Tater Tot, this music really is jamming. I like the idea of homeostasis, like everything we do is an attempt to attain it. I think that is a really important thing, but sometimes we try to go above and beyond that, right? Like if our homeostasis isn't a great place, aren't we usually working to like improve upon that? Oh yeah, comfort things go together a lot with nostalgia and past memories. That's a good point too. This idea of like how we define like nostalgia may be related to comfort. Because I've seen a couple people talk about like daydreaming or drawing, like the sketchbook comment. So maybe that is related to like nostalgia or like past good memories. I think of it being like good memories a lot of times. Ooh, bobbed my desk. Do you have a lot of plans for this weekend? Because it's Friday for me. I don't know if it's Friday for you. Hey, Rainy. I'm glad you could stop by. Hope you have a great rest of your day. It's already Saturday for you, Shion. That still means that you have like the rest of the weekend, though. Nothing but homework. Ooh. I work weekends. I do too. I enjoy comfort when watching cartoons, like certain types of cartoons. When I think of that, it makes me wonder if like those are the types of cartoons that we liked. I want to say as a kid, because like usually like a lot of cartoons are like kid like what we do as a kid, but not all of them, right? Like Family Guy isn't exactly for kids. It sounds like a lot of you have homework. I hope it's not a terrible amount of homework. I also don't know the cartoon of Amphibia or Infinity Train. I don't know those cartoons. School started, they gave us a lot of homework. I'm incredibly sorry. This feels like an interesting place to say, well, you know how to cope with that homework. This needs finger guns because it's super cheesy. Let's talk about how to find a therapist. I also don't know Owl House either. Apparently I don't know any cartoons, so I'll just go with that. Ignorance is bliss, that I don't know any cartoons at all. Except for Family Guy, apparently, which I've already referenced. So something that I've realized that I talk to people about a lot is like how to find a therapist. And I may talk to people that I'm already working with about this idea just because maybe they're at a place in therapy where switching therapists is a good idea, or they're moving to a place that I don't work. And so they need, like, we're talking about finding a therapist that actually like works where they live, those kinds of things. Sometimes I just talk to people that I'm not working with yet about this idea of finding a therapist. And I've kind of realized that it's not easy finding a therapist. And I think I forget that just because I work in this industry and I take a lot of that stuff for granted. I have my handy dandy notepad here. Can you see my icon? Yeah, there we go. So when it comes to finding a therapist, I wrote down a shit ton of notes about some of the biggest things that come to my mind when it comes to finding a therapist, and I thought we could talk about them. And if I catch questions as I go, I will answer them as I see them, that kind of a thing. I do think that therapy is cool because, of course, I'm biased and I'm gonna say that. So without further ado, probably just gonna be copying and pasting things. How to find a therapist. I do want to add some disclaimers as far as like, I realize that not everybody lives in America, obviously. And most of what I'm saying here is based on America. Like, this is the US is the system that I know and I'm familiar with, and the licensing boards and all of that jazz. So some of what I'm saying may apply to people who live internationally. Some of it may not, and I honestly would not know. I would not know what it would apply or not apply just because I'm totally unfamiliar with international shindigs. I also want to say that a lot of this is my personal opinion on finding a therapist. This is one of those things where, like, I cannot represent the entire mental health community as I talk about this, so there may be other mental health professionals who comment, who have like different opinions on some of the stuff I'm about to say. So I wanted to throw all of that stuff out there as sort of like general disclaimers. Whoa, this text is massive. Let's go with like size 16 font. That looks better. So, does a therapist mean a psychologist? No, not technically. As far as like in a practical way, bringing my handy dandy keyboard over. I might get tangled in cords. So, when I say therapist, think of that as like a broad umbrella term for people who are doing like talk therapy type things and the variety of ways that that can show up. And again, I can only speak to my general understanding of where I live when I say this, keep all of that in mind. Therapist doesn't actually equal psychologist. This is one of those things where like therapists have a great deal of like alphabet soups. We have a lot of letters after our names, and some of those letters are important and some of them are not. So therapists can be social workers. They can be counselors. You might see my spelling errors too. I don't know if Notepad corrects them, so there's spelling errors. There might actually be technical therapists, like marriage and family therapists. I think that's it. And then there might be psychologists. So the difference between these, a therapist or a social worker, I am technically a social worker. I use therapist because it's a general term for the actual work that I do. A social worker has their master's in social work, and a social worker can do therapy, which is why I call myself a therapist, just like a term that we know and we're aware of. But I can also do other things. So I can work in school districts. I can like work with CPS if I wanted to. There's a lot of other stuff that social workers can do. Social workers are like not just focused on therapy. Counselors and therapists, also, like, you have to have your master's for all of these things. Counselors and therapists are, my understanding, are essentially the same. If you were to ask a therapist if they were the same thing, they might say that they are not. And you might ask a counselor if they were the same thing, and they might say that they are not. The letters behind their name are different. They are essentially the same thing. A psychologist is different. A psychologist does the same work. We all do the same work. Realistically, we all do the same work. But a psychologist has their doctorate in psychology. So they technically have a higher level of education. That is the difference between all of those, and I hope that that answers that question. A lot of this is like the technicalities of it and like the technical letters behind our names. A psychiatrist, which is different than a psychologist, they're a doctor. They're a doctor who is really specialized in psychiatric medicine. So a psychiatrist is not really a therapist. They're a doctor who's like, their thing is psychiatric medication. Psychiatric medication, just like a neurologist, is like brain stuff that's not psychiatric medication, if all of that makes sense. So I hope that answers that question. When it comes to actually like finding a therapist, one of the biggest things, one of the ways that I start off is by asking people to really think about what are the 3 most important things when it comes to a therapist. I honestly do not care what these things are. It does not matter at all. These can be very practical things. These can be very personal things. So practical things would be things like availability. Like if my availability is weekends, like as in like the availability that I have as a therapist to meet with someone, but someone who wants to meet with me can't meet with me on the weekends, logically our schedules won't fit, right? Online versus in person. If someone really wants an in-person therapist, they're gonna have a hard time with an online therapist. It's really common for people to want a therapist who takes their insurance. How timely people respond to messages, all of these things are like very practical things that we may want from a therapist. And I think it's important to say that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter like what these things are that we want from our therapist. It just matters that we figure these things out. Because sometimes when I have conversations with people about these things, people can kind of shame, blame, and guilt themselves like, oh, am I allowed to want this? And then they don't kind of put it on their list, so to speak. And it is totally okay to want what you want from a therapist. I also want to point out that it's not just practical things that we may want from our therapist. We may want kind of like personality things. That's how I mentioned it. We may want like some things that like, and personality things are harder to figure out, but it may be like someone who has a good sense of humor, or someone who has a communication style or way of communicating that like makes sense to you, who has a lot of patience, maybe, I don't know, whatever personality stuff makes sense to you. And the reason why I say that is because when we look at the research about like what makes therapy effective. The connection that we have with our therapist is the number one thing that determines how effective therapy is. It isn't the letters after their name. It isn't whatever therapy styles or whatever they're trained in. It is the connection that we have. And that entirely makes sense to me, because if I am seeing a therapist and I don't like them, I'm not going to tell them shit about me. I'm not going to open up. Nothing in like the magic of therapy is going to happen. And so it is totally valid to have personality related things in this list for what we want from our therapist. Completely valid. It is totally okay, because that will determine how much we like and open up to and respond to our therapist. So with this list of 3 things that we want from our therapist, there's no right or wrong answers. The whole point of this is that this is going to guide the rest of our search, the rest of our process, all of that kind of stuff. I don't know what kinds of things you might have on your own personal list, but for me, I think sense of humor would be important. I think availability would be important. And I personally would probably want an online therapist, if I'm honest. But that is also me. And that has, like, my answers would have nothing to do with someone else. I have more to say about the personality stuff too, but I guess my thoughts on that probably are a little later. But like, therapists are people too. So I think a lot of times when I think of a therapist and like the stereotype of therapist, I think of like Freud. I think of like old white men, if I'm being honest. And when we look for therapists, if we know that we want very specific like personality things, I think it can help to... It really can help with that process of like opening up, because like I know that people have seen me as a therapist and they've instantly like it's really helped with that process of like opening up and building connection, because they've looked at me and they've said, oh, you're not an old white man. The gender actually doesn't have anything to do with it. Usually it's like, oh, you're not old. Like you'll understand what I'm talking about. Almost like I don't have to explain what an Instagram DM is to you, kind of a thing. I've also had people who are like, oh, you have tattoos, right? Like you're more relatable that way. Like you have piercings, right? Especially with teenagers, because they're like, oh my gosh, you're like, I feel like you're gonna get me more than like my parents, that kind of a thing. So I really want to stress that all of these things are totally okay. It does not matter what you put down here. What matters is that it's important to you and that we like figure those things out. There's this question of like, how can I feel safe with opening up to people? I feel like that's something that can be done in therapy, but I also feel like it's super hard to do that if we don't have the right therapist. Like if we don't feel like there's a click, or we don't feel like we connect it with our therapist, it's hard to open up with anyone, right? In a very practical way though, how do we find a therapist, right? So like, let's say we have all of these things. Oh, and that's a good point too. Like we don't usually open up on the first day. That's a really good point that I didn't mention. Again, some of these things are things that I take for granted because like this is just what I do. We don't usually go to therapy and like on the very first day we're like, here's everything. It is normal to have like that kind of gradual opening up process. But I think the idea is that we still want to feel like there is some connection there. There's still something that is happening, and we don't want to sit there 6 months in and be thinking to ourselves, I still feel like you're a stranger. Not that like the therapist should be sharing with you, but this idea of like, I don't feel like there's any connection. There's absolutely no clicking. Like almost like, I don't like you. That kind of a thing. Yeah, like why would you try opening up to someone if they don't accept you? Exactly. If you feel like the therapist is judging you, like you're not gonna open up. As far as like, so once we have these 3 things, I feel like these are kind of like the guiding force for basically everything else that happens when we look for a therapist. So in a very practical way, looking for a therapist, it's kind of like this idea of like, okay, well, now I know what these things are, but like, where do I look? Because that is also extremely overwhelming, and I will own that. That is like, huh. So when we are actually looking for a therapist, there's a lot of places to look, and I will own that. The way that I looked at this was I looked at kind of like the most common places that we can look, and I looked at the pros and cons of each of them. So the idea is we use these things, these three most important things that we figured out to help us decide which of these, like where we look for a therapist and which therapists we pay attention to, essentially. So that way it's not as overwhelming to look at all of this stuff. So where do we look for a therapist? And these all have like pros and cons for all of them. So first place is Google. Realistically, we probably use Google to find the rest of these in a very practical way. I feel like there's a very realistic pro of like a benefit to Google in that it's a wealth of information, which is fantastic. However, it's hard to really narrow it down. You have to really know like SEO, like Google search terms. You have to use the correct terms. You have to hope that the therapist use the correct terms that you are using to really make Google work for you when searching for a therapist. And as much as I like therapists, sometimes therapists don't use user-friendly terms on their websites, which doesn't help at all. So as much as I love Google, I feel like Google is better to find these other websites, if I'm honest. I love Google. Google's helpful. But there are other ways that I often use to find a therapist. The other ways that I find therapists are called directories. I realize that not everybody knows what a directory is. So my example, not everybody will know my example. I realize that this like ages me. So a directory is essentially a website where it lists a metric shit ton of therapists, depending on the directory. I think of it as the white pages for therapists, and that's the term that may date me. So if you know phone books and you've used phone books, a directory is like the white pages for therapists. If you don't know, if you've never used a phone book, this term really dates me, and just think of it as a listing for therapists. Anyways, so probably one of the most well-known therapy directories is Psychology Today. I don't know if you are familiar with Psychology Today, but if you Google anything related to therapists, I'd bet money. Not really, it's a term, but I would bet money that Psychology Today shows up pretty high up on that list. So there are a lot of advantages to Psychology Today. Take a very dramatic drink. There are a lot of advantages to Psychology Today. Psychology Today is a very, very large therapy directory. It is probably the biggest therapy directory. So that means like realistically, you're more likely to find a therapist that works for you. You can, like, it has a lot of search terms that you can use, so you can look for an online therapist, a local therapist. Psychology Today encourages their therapists to use videos. It's kind of like TikTok, right? Like only if TikTok was only 20-second videos and only for therapists, that would be like the 20-second videos that Psychology Today encourages their therapists to use. And the good part about the videos is it gives you a better sense of the therapist's personality. And that's the whole point, right? That's what we're looking for. We are looking for finding out if this therapist will work for you, including their personality. So the videos are fantastic, and the fact that Psychology Today really encourages the videos as much as they do is also fantastic. I consider that a pro. I consider that a good part. The bad parts about Psychology Today, as I copy and paste this over. This music is really good. So the bad parts about Psychology Today is that it can be really freaking overwhelming. In my area, so like where I live, if I were to just search for like all the therapists in my area, it's like over 17 pages of therapists. And Psychology Today, I don't know how much they talk about this to like people who aren't therapists, whatever, I don't care. Psychology Today also randomizes it, so that can also feel even more overwhelming. Psychology Today does it because they don't want it to be like an easy way for one therapist to have a distinct advantage over other therapists to like always show up at the top of the directory, which I totally get. But sometimes it can be really frustrating if you found a therapist that you liked and they were like on page 1 of Psychology Today, and then you go back a day later and they're not there, and suddenly you feel like you have to sift through like 17 pages of therapists to find that one person. So the fact that there are so many therapists can be an advantage, but it can also be incredibly fucking overwhelming. It can be a lot. The search function on Psychology Today, it can have a lot to be desired depending on what you're looking for. They also, if you are looking for an online therapist, you technically have to look in a different spot at the website to find just online therapists. And I talk a little, I want to talk a little more about like the reasoning why behind that, or I can't speak for why Psychology Today sorts it the way it does, but like I think there's a method behind that. And this idea that like some therapists are booked even when they're listed on there is probably just like, it's probably just an industry thing. Where I think sometimes therapists forget that they're listed on the website and they forget to kind of like update their availability. So sometimes people reach out to a therapist and they're like, hey, love everything about that. Absolutely love it. Can we like make an appointment? Can we talk? It feels like dating. Searching for a therapist is definitely like dating. Sometimes you got to try people out. Sometimes you got to reach out to people and you get ghosted, which is kind of shitty. Anyways, and you reach out to someone, they're like, yeah, I can't meet with you. So that can sometimes be a negative thing, which is not actually representative of Psychology Today. Maybe it's just an industry thing, and I'll own that. So Psychology Today is the biggest directory. It's probably the most common one. It's seen the most, but there are definite pros and cons to it. There is that question of like, I've been told I have to go ask my like regular doctor, my for a referral for a therapist. Sometimes that happens because insurance companies have a requirement of like, we won't pay unless there's a referral. If that isn't a factor, so basically if your insurance company hasn't said that, a lot of therapists don't require a referral. So you can like reach out to therapists, to Psychology Today, through whatever, and just ask them like, hey, can I get started with you? And most therapists that I know of don't require a referral, but that's definitely like a your mileage may vary kind of a thing. Another therapy directory is Good Therapy. I feel like they made that name just so it's like, well, if we call ourselves Good Therapy, will people think of us as the Good Therapy directory? I don't know. I wonder. So realistically, Good Therapy is very similar to Psychology Today. It's another rather large therapy directory, slightly smaller than Psychology Today though. But what I really like about Good Therapy is, my brain didn't process what pasted for a second, is that they have Good Therapy, in my opinion, has way better than being named Bad Therapy. That's true. Unless they're like, we want to target everybody who's sarcastic as fuck. If you're sarcastic, you will love every therapist on this website. I mean, that would be amazing. So Good Therapy has way better search options, in my opinion. So, or did I say Psychology Today or Good Therapy? Doesn't matter. Good Therapy, the good one, has better search options. So on Good Therapy, you can actually search specifically for for therapists who offer a free consultation, who have weekend availability and evening availability. And these three things can be hard to find. More of these two. More of like the weekend availability and the evening availability. So the fact that they actually let you search just for that is really cool. Psychology Today, as far as I know, I think I looked when I was like compiling all of this, doesn't do anything related to availability. So you can't search for availability. You have to like reach out to a therapist and say, hey, what's your availability? And they'll tell you. There's more work you have to do up front to find out someone's availability. Whereas with Good Therapy, you can just search for it before you contact someone, which is really nice. A free consultation is essentially, this is one of those terms that therapists use, and I think we forget that other people don't know what a consultation is. So a free consultation is when you have a chance to sit down with a therapist, sit down, phone call, video call, I don't know, however they decide to do it. And you get to chat with them before fully committing to it. So if you have insurance or you pay out of pocket, whatever, who cares? Basically, it means usually that you don't get charged. So you have time to kind of like test out their personality and see if you like them and see if you'll be a good fit, or see if they will be a good fit for you before you are committed to anything. I think that this is fantastic. I encourage everybody to take advantage of free consultations whenever possible. I encourage people to ask if they have free consultations, even if it's not listed. But I love the fact that Good Therapy lets you specifically search for it. So that to me is like a good thing about Good Therapy. Some of the bad things about Good Therapy is very similar to Psychology Today. It can be really overwhelming to look through because there's a lot of therapists. They don't have, Good Therapy doesn't encourage the videos as much. Good Therapy is kind of like, hey, if you have a video that you've made, it has to be a YouTube video, which is like a different format than Psychology Today's like TikTok style, vertical alignment stuff. If you have a YouTube video, you can put it up here, but they don't really enforce it as much as Psychology Today, which means there are far less therapists who have videos. So you don't have a chance to really see their personality before you reach out. With a lot of these therapy places, you're going to find the same therapists listed in multiple places. And I found that to be especially true between Good Therapy and Psychology Today. Those are probably like the two most common therapy directories. They're not the only ones, for sure. But those are the two most common and the two that probably have some of the biggest overlap. The rest of these are kind of like smaller, if you will, and they're more niche. They're more like for specific things that we're looking for. So Open Path Collective is a place that we can go if we have a hard time financially. That's all that it is for. That's all that it's for. So every therapist that is listed on Open Path Collective's website has agreed to charge people a lower price. So the sessions that you would get with your therapist, if you found them through Open Path Collective, would be anywhere between like $30 to $80. It entirely depends on like the actual prices agreed upon and the type of therapy that we're talking about. There's a certain amount of like qualifying financially. Don't exactly know how they count that. They do online therapy and in-person therapy. They do have you pay like a $59 like one-time fee to Open Path. And the purpose behind it is to like keep the website going. Once you pay the one-time fee, you're considered a member, and then you can switch therapists between any therapist listed on the website. They don't care. So, and you can also contact the therapist before you pay. So basically, if there's only one therapist on the website that you like really like, and you reach out to them and it turns out that they don't work for you for any reason, you don't have to pay the $60, if that makes sense. So Open Path Collective, I really like, because oftentimes when people talk about like why they may not go to therapy, finances may be a factor in that. And Open Path is a great place to look if that's the case. Some of the downsides of Open Path is that it is a smaller directory. It's a smaller place to look inherently because of like, if all they do is work with therapists who are okay with charging a lower price, they have less therapists who are willing to do that. So it is a smaller directory. And because it's a smaller directory, you may not find therapists who fit what you're looking for. Hey, Jack Gamer and Pop Tart. There are a couple more directories that I felt were important to mention. One of them is Therapy Den. Therapy Den is all about being inclusive. Like they have all of their therapists kind of, I can't remember if it's signing a thing or agree to a thing. Anyways, all of their therapists on there like have to agree to some way, shape, or form to be inclusive. They have a lot of search options. Sometimes an overwhelming amount of search options. You can search for price too on Psychology or on Therapy Den. And you can look for online therapists and in-person therapists. some of the cons are like some of the downsides are the same things that we've kind of seen before, where you might have repeat therapists, or just in general a smaller directory. So inherently sometimes it means it's harder to find what you're looking for. And then the last one that I felt was also important to mention is kind of similar to Therapy Den, and that's inclusive therapists. As you might imagine with the name, it is all about inclusivity. You actually have to, like, to be listed on inclusive therapists, you have to like write almost like a novel about like how you're inclusive, what you do to be inclusive. Like it's a bit more involved as far as like how much they really want to prove that their therapists are inclusive. They have a lot of search options, online and person search options, a ton of search options. The downside is it is a smaller directory. So hey, Loner, thanks for joining us. So these are some of the, like, this is a lot. Holy cow, I wrote down a lot. This is why finding a therapist is overwhelming. I'll own that. So when we are looking for a therapist, I've mentioned like all these different places that we can go, these directories, things like that. So what we do though, what we do with all this information is we take these 3 most important things that we talked about before. I don't care. I don't care what they are. And you know, if it's money or whatever, we take these things and we narrow down our searches. So I had mentioned before that Psychology Today in my area has like a 17 pages of therapists. So let's say the 3 most important things for me are finding an online person or an online therapist, finding a therapist who has a good sense of humor, and I don't know, money, right? Psychology Today does have a search option for money, but it's like $signs. And I think they have a thing for sliding scale. So I could search for only online therapists. I could search for therapists who say that they're $1 sign instead of $3 signs, whatever that means. And then if I'm looking for and then however many therapists are left from that, I imagine that we probably took it down from 17 pages to at least, I don't know, 5. That is way less therapist pages to read through when I'm trying to decide if they have a good sense of humor. So this idea of like the 3 most important things to us, we basically use that to narrow down which therapists we actually look at and pay attention to when we're looking to the directories or Google or all these other things. It guides our search for the rest of this process. That way, because otherwise it's incredibly overwhelming, and it still is overwhelming, but this significantly narrows it down. I've worked with clients where we're doing this together and it's been, I don't know, 17 pages, and we narrow it down to like 2 or 3, and that is way easier to look at. And even then it's super easy for the clients to look through it and be like, no, yes, because of, I don't know, a variety of reasons. And so this to me, like having these things to narrow it down helps a lot, because it's super easy to look at the 17 pages and to say, this is too much, this is too overwhelming, and then to stop there. So having this set up first, where we look at the 3 most important things to us, if we have that set up first before we start looking, that guides the entire rest of the process. Some other things that I think are important is if the therapist has any kind of videos available, I think those are important to take a look at, whether it be just like regular YouTube videos. Some of these directories have like YouTube videos that can be linked, or just like the TikTok style videos that Psychology Today encourages, because again, it gives you more of an idea of what their personality is like. And it's incredibly important. It's so important. It's going to tell you whether they are just going to stare blankly at you or whether they're animated, like all of those things. Because again, the relationship that you are going to have with your therapist is the most important thing. This is like the number one thing that determines how successful someone is in therapy. It is not the letters behind their name. It is not all of these other stuff. So the reason why, I just gotta scroll. The reason why I said that it does not matter. Like there are no right answers. There are no wrong answers with what you put for your 3 most important things, is because if these things are important to you, it will impact your relationship with your therapist. So there are no wrong answers. There are no right answers. Some other things that I think are important to consider is that, how do I say this nicely? Therapists can be very bad about talking about themselves in a way that doesn't sound like a college brochure. And if you've ever looked for therapists, I think you know what I mean. So I don't know how many times I have, again, like, been working with my clients about like trying to find therapists, and we've like looked at these Psychology Today profiles, and there are therapists, a lot of therapists unfortunately out there, who will say something like, I went to, I don't know, pick a college, I went to UCLA in this year, and I went to, I don't know, Brown in this year, I don't know, pick colleges, I don't care, I'm just making this stuff up. And I don't like that personally. And I feel like I'm shitting on therapists, and that's not my intention. I don't want to shit on my profession. That's not my intention, but like, nowhere in our education, in grad school, where they teach us about therapy related things, they don't teach us about marketing. They don't teach us about businessy type stuff. So what that means is that when therapists go to create this profile about Psychology Today or about like whatever, they don't know how to talk about themselves in a way that like makes sense. So there are a lot of therapy profiles that are kind of like, I went to this school and I went to this school. And I think that what is hard about that is when we're looking for a therapist and we're trying to tell if we can connect with them, it sounds like an AI wrote that profile and not a person, and it's hard to then connect to that person. Or I guess a better way to put it is, it's hard to tell if we can connect to that person. Because realistically, just because they essentially wrote a college brochure paper thing for their profile, it doesn't mean that like there's not the potential for us to connect to them. It just means that we can't tell, which makes it incredibly difficult to find a therapist that will work for us. I think that is probably the most like the hardest part about finding like the personality traits when it comes to these profiles, is that if we have profiles that are written where they're not really like talking about themselves in a meaningful way, it's hard to tell what their personality is like. That is definitely something that I've noticed. I've also noticed some people have pictures that aren't them. And again, like, you know, maybe it's like scenery, it's a tree, it's a rock, something like that. And that also makes it hard to tell if we're going to connect with them. And I think it's totally valid to not look at those profiles because we can't tell if we're going to connect or not. I think it's totally valid to like try those therapists out. That's definitely a your mileage may vary kind of thing. But this is something that I have noticed because again, like we can't tell if we'll connect with them or not. And I don't know if you have noticed this, but I definitely have when looking at other therapist profiles. Something else that I think is important, I feel like it's, I guess, relatively new in the world of therapy, is online therapy. The rules, the laws about online therapy they're different from state to state, which makes it harder to know anything about it. And that is not your job to know. Totally not your job to know. But I basically say this is the like what I say may be different from where you live. That's what I mean by that. But not every therapist does online therapy. Not every therapist likes online therapy. And some therapists only do online therapy. So again, like your mileage may vary. But my opinion is that online therapy can make it easier to find a therapist. Because if I only look for therapists within my specific city, I'm only limited to therapists within that city, right? But what online therapy means is that I can look for therapists within that entire state that I live in, which is inherently more therapists, and which means I have a higher chance of connecting with someone and finding someone that'll work for me, availability, price, all those great things. So I think that that's an important thing to recognize too. It's like relatively new, all things considered. What I do want to put out there is that if you are looking for an online therapist, I recommend asking if they plan to continue online therapy, because sometimes people kind of do online therapy just because of World events. You can read the subtext there. And they don't plan to continue to do online therapy forever. And that's not inherently bad, but it's important for you to know. If you're making a decision about a therapist, it's important for you to know these things. And if you have insurance and you're looking for an online therapist, it's important to ask your insurance company if they are going to pay for online therapy, because some do and some don't. Insurance, I don't know, does what they do. Some of the other like last comments that I have about finding a therapist is basically this idea that like some therapists don't make it easy, and this is not on you to know. There's just like a lot of alphabet soup behind our names, and I've mentioned this before, right? And these like interventions like CBT, DBT, ACT, EMDR, it's alphabet soup. In no way are you required to know this stuff. And in most cases, it's not really important for you to know. It's really the therapist's job. Like, it would be my job to tell you, like, here are my thoughts for how we could approach this. Here are my thoughts for how we could approach your anxiety. Here are my thoughts for how we could approach your depression, trauma, like all that stuff. It's really on the therapist to know that stuff and to approach it and explain it to you. It's not your job to know that alphabet soup. There's too much going on finding a therapist. You don't need to know this stuff. Don't worry about it. I'm gonna give you permission to forget about all those alphabet soup things. The idea of a free consultation is a term that is used a lot when searching for a therapist, but a lot of people don't know what it means. So I wanted to kind of like define it. And I mentioned it earlier, I'll just mention it again, that a free consultation is it's a chance to talk to the therapist before you're fully committed, before you pay. I highly encourage everybody to take advantage of it, because it lets you really try out their personality. It lets you see them in their like home environment most of the time. Some people do a phone call. That still gives you a chance to see their personality though. But if you're going into their office, it lets you see like, what is their office like? What is their receptionist like? Do they have free candy? Like all of these things that may or may not be important to you. It lets you kind of see what it's like. And it lets you decide not to make appointments if that's what you want to do. If the therapist doesn't like directly say, I have free consultations, it's also completely okay to ask. There's like not a therapist out there who would judge or shame, blame, or guilt you for asking about this thing. It's kind of like an industry standard term that like we all understand. There's also this idea of a sliding scale, which is, again, this is a term that like therapists use because we're used to it. This is like our term. But then we forget that people who aren't therapists don't know what this means. So it's important to know what this means, I guess. Because like even psychology today uses this term. But why would you click it if you didn't know what it meant? So the sliding scale is essentially, it's a fancy way of saying a reduced cost. So let's say that a therapist charges $200 for one therapy session, which can be a lot. If the therapist feels like it is appropriate, and how they determine that is completely up to the therapist. It's their shtick. If they feel like it is appropriate to reduce the cost, that's what a sliding scale is. The one thing that I want to add that I don't think I mentioned is that you cannot legally do a sliding scale and insurance. So for example, if someone has insurance and their copay is, I don't know, $50, $80, the therapist cannot reduce that copay anymore. They cannot change that at all. That's part of the insurance contract. But if you're not using insurance and the therapist decides to use a sliding scale, like that's an option. A sliding scale is essentially what, where are you? Open Path Collective is. Open Path Collective is essentially asking therapists to have a sliding scale that is very specific. So sliding scale, like that's what a sliding scale means. You can't do it plus insurance. You can only do one or the other. But it basically means that the therapist has said, yeah, I'll agree to charging you less money. Some therapists require like proof of your financial situation. Others don't. It's kind of up to the therapist. It's also entirely up to the therapist to decide if they're going to do a sliding scale at all. It is also completely okay to ask if the therapist does a sliding scale, even if it is not listed on their directory page or their website or anything like that. And the reason why I say that is because So it's always completely okay to ask about free consultation, sliding scale, these things. They're very normal terms, they're very normal concepts. We're all familiar with them when we're therapists. It's okay to ask about them, even if they're not specifically listed. You are no way burdening the therapist. You're no way asking for too much. You're basically asking and giving the therapist room to think about what they want to do. It is not impeding at all. And because the therapist can always say no, right? Because if the therapist is offended by this, do you want to work with that therapist? That's how I see it. So this is actually the last of it, I believe. I know it is incredibly overwhelming. Incredibly overwhelming. That's why I try to start with this idea of like the 3 most important things and how can we go from there. I should probably space this out more, but it doesn't matter. Anyways, so having said all of that, I don't know if there are like maybe questions that I can answer, because finding a therapist is like it's a lot. Do I specialize in a particular topic or demographic? I work with anxiety and trauma in particular. My caseload is full right now, though, so I'm not taking on any new clients. But anxiety and trauma are like, those are like my bread and butter things. The first time I talked to my therapist, it was free. I wasn't even aware of it. I mean, that is something that I really encourage people to, because like I've heard a lot of stories from people where they've gotten so like far into therapy, 3 months, 6 months, and then they feel like, and then that's when they start to feel like they're not connecting or something isn't right or they're feeling judged. And I look at it as, I would much rather know at our first meeting, which is like a free consultation, I would much rather know if I can kind of get that sense for if something isn't quite a good fit, at least if I can feel that on my end. I would much rather talk about that early on than like have someone invest like this time, energy, emotional energy, and then end up telling them, 3 or 6 months into a relationship, like therapy relationship, that I don't think it's a good fit. So for me, I kind of look at it as really trying to take care of people the way I feel like they deserve to be taken care of. So I really encourage people to do the free consultations even when people do meet with me. Hey, Gabrielle. I hope that it is helpful. Once this stream is done processing, however YouTube processes stuff, I'll put it up too. I like the idea of doing these like just chatting streams about therapy related things as much as I kind of can. Because it's not always easy to do this stuff or to find this stuff, or other therapy related things aren't always easy to know or find out about. For some reason, therapy feels like a very kind of secretive world, even though it's not intended to be. It's not purposeful, but sometimes it feels that way. And I don't really feel like it should be that way. Any advice on how to talk during the first few sessions? Like how to break the ice? Well, I want to put out there that it's not all on you to do that, right? So depending on how the therapist kind of conducts their first meetings, they may just end up asking a lot of questions of you to kind of get an idea of like what's going on. So they may ask about, your family history, your history, about like school or like work, like all those kinds of things, to get them like a general picture of your life. That may happen in like a first meeting. And that, in my mind, that kind of takes a lot off of you to like have something to talk about. As far as like general meetings, it also isn't on you. I feel when I think about the meetings that I have with clients where it's like our first meetings, probably some of the first things that I will do is I'll just ask them like, how are you doing? Right? Like, how are you doing right now in general? And also like, how have things been since we last kind of talked? And then I'll just kind of ask in general, right? So if we're talking about anxiety, I might ask like, how has your anxiety been in general? is that a normal thing for you? Because just because someone is anxious now doesn't mean that's normal for them. And then, you know, I'll ask about general patterns, because in the very beginning of therapy, it's a lot of information gathering. Knowing me and my personality, I will also do stupid jokes. I might ask someone what's cooking home skillet, just because it's a stupid joke, and the people that tend to like my personality find the dad jokes hopefully not horrible. I would hope they don't find them horrible. I guess I look at it as like, if they like my personality enough to work with me as a therapist, hopefully there's some amount of not hatred for the dad jokes. And so, I mean, that's kind of a thing too, is like, when you go to these first few sessions, it's not all on you to like find something to talk about. When I worked in like an office, I had so many Batmans everywhere, and people would talk about the Batmans, right? Or I imagine over the next week, people will talk about Taylor Swift. Like, sometimes that's just like an easy way to ease into it. So there are a variety of ways you can kind of like break the ice that way. Humor is definitely a way to lighten the mood. I personally am a huge fan of dad jokes. That's just me. But I also look at it as like, when I'm looking for a therapist, I'm more likely to find a therapist who likes dad jokes, or who, like, you know, tolerates them, chuckles, you know, that kind of thing. Because again, like, that would be my personality and the kind of person that I would be looking for. My mom is old-fashioned and doesn't take mental health seriously, so she wouldn't be willing to get me a therapist. Are there any good online programs that are cheap or free? I feel like my answer to that is very complicated. So first off, in my like resource type things that are like the variety of links that are in every video and my social media and all that stuff, there is a website called 7 Cups, maybe 7 Cups of Tea, I can't remember. And essentially that's like a non-therapy way to get support. I cannot guarantee the quality of it all the time. The concept is you go there and you talk to people who are volunteers. Are those volunteers helpful? Potentially sometimes. Are those volunteers unhelpful? It would probably depend on who's volunteering. So that's always a thought that I have when someone comes to me and they basically say like, I am not at a, like my family won't let me get therapy, that kind of thing. That is one of those things where I recommend going to school counselors and talking about it. Your school counselors, assuming you're in school, your school counselor may, first off, and I don't mean guidance counselor, I mean like hopefully your school has like an actual, because guidance counselors don't have to be actual therapists, if that makes sense. Depending on your school, depending on your area, this is definitely a your mileage may vary kind of answer. But if your school has an actual like school counselor, sometimes they can do therapy while you're at school. Or they can recommend other resources. And I say that because in some areas you can consent to therapy if you're under 18. And then there's kind of more the logistical area things to figure out, like how do you get to the therapist. So for example, some states you can be 16 and technically consent to therapy, or even 14 and technically consent to therapy. But I can't speak for what that looks like. I don't know state laws. I'm not a lawyer in no way, shape, or form. But your school counselor should know more about that and should be able to hopefully help you out with that. So that is my answer for that. Do I know about DBT therapy? Yes, I do. I am not like specifically trained in DBT therapy, so my knowledge of DBT is limited. It is not something that I practice very often, so I can't like fully speak to DBT therapy. I know and practice. I say that like it's yoga. Like I know and practice other forms of therapy far more often. Like DBT therapy, I guess for people who like don't know, is when you meet with a therapist, the therapist kind of hears what's going on, what you're kind of struggling with. And they are basically kind of deciding like, what is a treatment plan? Basically like, what is our plan to kind of treat what is going on? And we can also look, another way to think of a treatment plan is to basically say, what is our plan to help you reach your goals for therapy? right? Because when we go to a therapist, we often want something. We do everything for a reason. We do everything for a purpose. So when we're going to a therapist, we want something from that. And so the therapist is basically saying, okay, here's what you want from therapy. Let's make sure it's realistic here, right? And here's our plan to try to get you there. And so a lot of times then the therapist is basically saying, here is a particular therapy, intervention, treatment. Here's basically a type of therapy that the therapist is trained in. It's unethical for a therapist to use a type of therapy that they're not trained in. So here's a type of therapy that I know of, I'm familiar with, and like the evidence says could be helpful for what you're struggling with, that we'll use. And so oftentimes it's like built into the treatment plan. Sometimes that can kind of change just because like, as we learn more about what you're struggling with, maybe what you're struggling with is a little different than we initially thought. But DBT is one type of therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy. That's what it stands for. This is one of those, DBT is one of those alphabet soup things that I basically said, don't worry about. It's not your job to worry about, because it's the therapist's job to hear what you're struggling with and say, okay, well, I think like DBT, for example, would be helpful for you. I hope that makes sense. But DBT is not something that I am trained in. So I look at it as this is unethical for me to actually use with people. I may like pick and choose like very basic DBT things that like also overlap with other things that I am trained in, but I don't actually like go full into DBT. So hopefully that answers that. Is there a big difference between DBT and CBT? I don't know how much I can answer that, Gabriel, just because, again, I'm not trained in DBT. So like, I feel like my impression of DBT is probably different than how it's actually practiced. And so like, heaps of fucking salt on this answer. So much salt, and so much of it, your mileage may vary, but every therapy, every one of these alphabet fucking soups out there, every therapy intervention started somewhere. So some guy out there, usually some guy, not for all of them, mostly guys, some guy out there found a thing, just like stumbled upon this way of thinking or whatever, and basically was like, oh, this is helpful. And then they did a bunch of research and they found it actually is helpful, and they developed a bunch of structure behind it. And that's how we have therapies, right? So CBT is cognitive behavioral therapy. Oh gosh, don't train me on who, or don't quiz me on who started CBT. I believe it was by Ellis and Beck in the 60s. Don't quiz me on that. I may be wrong. Anyways, CBT has been so incredibly like popular, and there's a shit ton of research behind it, that since CBT was kind of like born, they're called like second generation or third generation versions of CBT. So basically things that are very similar to CBT and very much like CBT, but not CBT. And that is where DBT comes from. So CBT came first, and then off of that came DBT. These are the things that like you don't actually need to know. So CBT is basically this idea of let's think about our own thinking. Let's think about your stinking thinking is essentially the concept, because the idea is our thoughts that our thoughts impact our actions and emotions, essentially. And so if we change our thoughts, we change what we do, and we change how we feel, right? So we look at our thoughts, and this is like the super TLDR of CBT. We look at our thoughts, we look at deeper level thoughts. How can we change that? There's a lot of journaling, there's a lot of homework in like technical CBT. DBT is a little less of that. DBT, from my understanding, is more mindfulness, meditation. It's a lot more of like, I always picture like riding the wave of our emotions. It's so like, that's how I picture DBT. I picture DBT as more of like essentially like mindfulness and meditation mixed with CBT. That's how I picture it, not trained in it. So take, oh, that was so much grain of salt. I knew that. I am familiar with Healthy Gamer, but I don't watch the videos very often. And like when we're trained on this stuff, we want, so as a therapist, like we're kind of sitting here going, okay, I'm hearing what this person is struggling with. I know what I'm trained in, and I know what the evidence like says, because we need to stay on top of like what the evidence says is like, we don't want to use an intervention that isn't supported by evidence. But we also want to use one of these alphabet soup things, one of these interventions that research shows will be effective for what we feel like that person is struggling with. And if something that I do all the time is, if I'm not trained in something that I feel like this person is struggling with, that to me is another reason behind the free consultation, is because I want to be able to refer them out. I want to be able to say, hey, it sounds like you're struggling with whatever the fuck it is we're talking about, and I'm not trained in that. Like, I feel like X, Y, and Z therapy could be really helpful for you, or X, Y, and Z thing, and like that's just like not something that I'm trained in. But here is such and such person, or such and such person that is trained in that, and I believe is open for whoever. And so that for me is another huge reason behind the free consultation. And I do that, like when people come to me for things I'm not trained in, I do that all the time, because that to me is a reason, is a way to get people the care that they need. Because it also, like bad therapy does harm, and I don't want to do bad therapy by doing things I'm not trained in. In some therapy things like EMDR, which is another alphabet soup, like therapists like really have to have very specific training in to do too. I'm interested in psychological stuff and I want to learn more for research to my game. Any recommendation on learning more? I don't even know. I think it probably depends on like what kind of psychological stuff we're talking about, because I guess where I'm coming from with saying that is because like I'm still learning, growing, and changing with this stuff. It's actually a requirement to like be able to continue to do what I do, is that I get like 30 hours every year of continuing education units, which basically means every year I have to spend 30 hours continuing to learn this stuff. So there's never a point where we just like know everything about mental health. We are always continuing to learn it. So even as therapists, I'm required to keep learning this stuff. So it probably depends on like what we're talking about here. Bye, Ben. It's nice to see you. Oh wow, we've been talking about this for a while. There's also, once we're done with stream today, there's also a new video that I will put out that starts a new series, which I feel like there's a lot of mental health conversations in that video, so that's a thing. It's good that new insights are constantly being made though. Yeah, I think it's fantastic. So some therapies are incredibly new. So EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, that's one of those things you don't actually have to know. Don't worry about the alphabet soup. I forget it half the time. I believe that was invented in like the 90s. Don't quote me on that. And like there's this kind of infamous story about it where the lady who invented it, whose name I can't remember off the top of my head right now, I'm sure it'll come to me once I'm not here, was like walking down this, like she had like she was very overwhelmed with, I believe, a cancer diagnosis, and was doing research on other things. She was walking down the sidewalk and like she noticed that her eyes, like as her eyes were going back and forth, she was like feeling better. And that just like spawned this whole new area of research into trauma that continues today. So I think the way that people invented these things is sometimes fascinating, and the fact that we are still coming up with new things, which also fits the world that we live in, right? If we were still sticking to therapies that were invented decades ago, would that fit the world that we live in today, where the world that we live in today has social media and like all the pressures of social media and all the pressures of like the 24-hour news networks? And not only that, but like we live in a world where social distancing has been incredibly helpful. And so I've heard a great deal of my colleagues talk about how sometimes they like online therapy because then people don't have to wear a mask, so they can see more emotions and more of what's going on for people. And so having a field that can adapt is so incredibly helpful, so we can always adapt to the fact that people are adapting. Because if we actually want to be helpful for people, I feel like that's how we do it. I do feel like this is a good place to kind of stop. I would love to hear other ideas. Actually, no, I take that back. Do you have other ideas for like these just chatting streams? You know, today I thought it would be a good idea to talk about like how to find a therapist, but what are some other things that you would like to talk about for this kind of format? Bots. Healthy and unhealthy things for your mental health. You enjoy these, Basil? I enjoy them too. It's nice to talk. Hey, Mick, it's nice to see you here. Setting boundaries. Holiday related stuff, yeah. Chamomile, you had asked like how to talk to your therapist about identifying as like a gender that your therapist like doesn't quite prefer. And I don't quite know if we're talking like the LGBT community or not, but something that I wanted to put out there is like, just because your therapist may prefer something doesn't mean that they won't work with you. I also wonder how carrying that around with you may impact your relationship with your therapist. So I think that those are like, I think that that's something to bring up personally. Just because I can see those things impacting therapy and sometimes ways that we don't see. But again, like just because I prefer and like my real wheelhouse is like anxiety and therapy doesn't mean that I don't work with people who struggle with ADHD or who struggle with depression. And like, I don't turn those people away just because it's not like my specialty. And sometimes it's an overlap. And so I don't tell the people that I work with, oh, well, like you have anxiety and depression, but like, I don't do that depression shit. So like, it's something that your therapist really is, like they're the only ones who can speak for that. But I think that like these are my initial thoughts, even though I cannot speak for your therapist. And so I guess I wonder if those are things that we can always kind of consider too, is that we don't always know, just because someone prefers something doesn't mean that it's a boundary, I guess, is a way to speak of it. And this is something that can definitely apply to like all of our things. Sometimes we hear something about like someone preferring something and we just assume that they will then hate it if it's anything other than that. So I am going to have pizza after this. So let's say I tell someone I prefer Hawaiian pizza, especially if we have a hard time with people pleasing and all these other things. Sometimes we interpret that as, well, like, you know, me, like, they won't like anything other than Hawaiian. Like, they won't like it. They absolutely won't. Like, we interpret boundary or preferences as something other than a preference. We interpret it as anything other than that is something we absolutely cannot do. When a preference is a preference. So I think that that is definitely something to consider for a lot of things. Still have pizza left? I'm gonna make it. It's like a frozen pizza that I got earlier today. Yeah, I think boundaries is often like a huge thing, which ironically I think relates to the holiday stuff, right? Because how many times are family members sitting here going like, oh, what about this for the holidays? What about that for the holidays? And like, how do we tell them no, right, when it's a boundary? And I do think too that if we are talking about therapists who kind of specialize or work with the LGBT community, Therapy Den is one of those places for that. Inclusive Therapist is another great place for that. And those aren't like the only things that those directories are for. Those are like some of the big ones, or some of the big things that I think of when I think of inclusivity. Of course, those are not the only things. How to get out of bed. Ooh. The boundaries one seems like a big one. I think my goal for now is to kind of get some ideas for what we could talk about over like next time. Sounds like boundaries and like the holiday stuff are some big ones. But I feel like this is good to stop. And then we'll stop the stream, and in like a minute to win it kind of thing, there will be a new video up on the channel. Sound good? And this stream will be up after. This stream will be up as like its own video. Probably like tomorrow-ish would be my guess, to give YouTube time to like fully process it. All that good stuff that YouTube does with stuff. Yeah, it was nice to hang out. I will enjoy my pizza. Thank you very much. Yeah, it was fun to hang out. I'm looking forward to having more of these types of like mental healthy streams. So I will peace out. I will make my pizza and I will let you enjoy the video that I pop up after this. Have a nice, wonderful, fantastic, comforting rest of your day, night, evening, morning, whatever time of day it is. Bye.